She didn't mean to fall asleep. Clara Donovan had just finished a double shift, 14 hours on her feet. 2 buses missed, 1 train pulling away from the platform right as she reached it. Taillights blinking red through the dark like they were laughing at her. She was just trying to get home. She didn't see the man in the tailored black suit before she dropped into the empty seat beside him. Didn't register the silence that rippled through the car when she sat down. Didn't mean for her head to tilt. Didn't mean for her cheek to land against his shoulder. She was too tired to care. The entire train car froze. Because the man she'd just used as a pillow was Luca Moretti. And men like Luca Moretti do not get touched, ever. He should have shoved her off. He should have stood, signaled his men, had her removed before she'd even opened her eyes. Instead, he let her sleep. And when his gaze dropped to her wrist, to the bruising just visible beneath her sleeve, something in his expression changed. Because Luca Moretti had seen her before. In a diner, months ago, serving him coffee like he was just another tired man at the counter. Not a name people whispered, not someone to fear, just a man. That had stuck with him longer than he'd ever admit. What Clara didn't know, curled asleep against a stranger's shoulder on a silent, staring train car, was that she wasn't just exhausted from work. Someone was threatening her little brother. And the debt she'd been quietly bleeding herself dry to pay off wasn't even hers. It belonged to the one man on earth who could make Luca Moretti's whole world catch fire. Before we go back to the moment her eyes finally close on that train, if you believe some people are carrying more than anyone around them will ever know, hit subscribe, because this story is about to show you exactly what that costs, and exactly who finally noticed. And tell me in the comments, be honest, have you ever been so exhausted you didn't care who was sitting next to you? Type, "I've been there," below, if you know exactly how Clara felt in that seat. Now, let's go back to the last train of the night, to a seat she never should have chosen, and the moment Luca Moretti decided not to look away. 14 hours. Clara counted them the way she'd started counting most things lately, not because it helped, but because the number gave the exhaustion a shape she could hold on to. 14 hours on her feet at the diner, then 3 more scrubbing floors at the office building on 5th, her knees screaming somewhere around hour 11 and never quite stopping since. She'd missed the 10:42 by 4 seconds. Watched it pull away, red lights blinking through the dark like they knew exactly how little she had left to give. The 11:15 was her last shot before a 2-hour wait in a station that smelled like bleach and regret. She made it. Barely. The car was half empty, fluorescent light buzzing overhead in a way that would have annoyed her on a normal night. Tonight she didn't have room left to be annoyed by anything. Her feet had gone past aching into something that didn't have a name. Blisters she hadn't looked at in 2 days, rubbing raw inside shoes that used to fit. There was a seat. She took it. She didn't look at the man beside her. Didn't have the energy for the small, automatic scan she usually gave strangers. The one that cataloged threat before politeness. She just sat, exhaled like the air had been sitting in her lungs for a week, and let her spine finally stop pretending it could hold her upright a second longer. She felt the fabric of his suit against her cheek before she registered she'd moved at all. By then, it was already done. Her head had found his shoulder like it belonged there, like her body had simply run out of arguments against gravity and comfort both. She didn't wake up. Around her, the car went very, very quiet. A woman near the door pressed a hand flat against her own chest. A man 2 seats down went rigid, eyes flicking toward the pair near the window and then away again, like looking too long might cost him something. Somewhere behind them, someone's breath caught audibly. Luca Moretti did not move. He'd felt her drop against him the same instant everyone else had seen it. The soft, boneless collapse of someone whose body had simply stopped negotiating with her. And every instinct honed over a decade of never letting anyone close enough to matter told him to shift, to stand. To have her removed before the image of it settled into anyone's memory as something worth repeating. He didn't do any of it. He looked at her instead. Up close, exhaustion wore her differently than he'd expect fear or deference to. There was no artifice to it. None of the careful performance he was used to reading on faces turned toward him. Just a woman who had run entirely out of herself, asleep on a stranger's shoulder because staying upright had finally cost more than she had left to spend. He knew her. The realization arrived quiet and certain, the way most things did for him. A diner 3 blocks from his second property downtown, months ago. A rare night he'd sat at the counter instead of a booth, wanting 5 minutes where no one recognized the weight of his name. She'd poured his coffee without flinching, without the too careful deference people gave him once they understood who he was. She'd looked at him like he was just a man having a bad night. He'd thought about that longer than he cared to admit. Now she slept against him on a public train, oblivious to the 11 pairs of eyes locked on them both, and he found himself doing something he rarely allowed. Cataloging details slower than necessary, the way he might a room before deciding whether it was safe to enter. Her hands, folded loosely in her lap, told their own story. Blistered along the palm, a shallow burn-scarred pink across 2 knuckles, the kind of mark a kitchen left on someone who moved too fast for her own protection, or someone whose exhaustion made carelessness inevitable. A faint tremor ran through her fingers even in sleep, the particular shake of a body running on adrenaline long after the reserves should have quit. Then his gaze moved higher and stilled. Her sleeve had ridden up an inch where her arm rested against her own leg, and beneath it, just visible in the flat fluorescent light, a bruise bloomed dark along the inside of her wrist. Not the shape of an accident. Fingers. Someone's fingers, gripped hard enough to leave a map of exactly where they'd held on. Something in his chest went cold, and very still, the particular stillness that men who worked for him had learned, over years, to fear more than shouting. He didn't wake her. He watched the bruise instead, filing its shape away with the same precision he gave everything that mattered, and found himself, for reasons he didn't examine too closely, arranging his shoulder a fraction more solid beneath her cheek. Not to wake her. To make sure she stayed exactly where she was. The train slowed. Brakes hissed. Fluorescent light flickered once overhead as the doors prepared to open at the next station, and Luca kept his eyes on the woman sleeping against him, still cataloging, still calculating exactly what kind of trouble left marks like that on someone who served coffee for a living. The doors opened. 2 men stepped through. Dark coats, unhurried, the particular economy of movement that marked them instantly to anyone who knew what to look for. They scanned the car out of habit. Then they saw him. Saw her, asleep against his shoulder, his hand resting with quiet, deliberate stillness near her own. And both men went utterly rigid, the color draining visibly from one man's face as he realized exactly whose personal space had just been breached in front of an entire train car of witnesses. Neither of them moved. Neither of them dared to. The taller of the 2 men moved first, hand already extending toward Clara's shoulder, with the brisk, efficient motion of someone trained to remove problems quickly and without conversation. "Marco!" Luca's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The hand stopped an inch from her sleeve. Marco straightened instantly, recalibrating, his eyes flicking from Clara's sleeping face to his boss's expression like he was reading a language that had suddenly changed its grammar without warning. Beside him, the second man had gone very still, waiting for a cue he clearly hadn't expected to need. "Boss?" Marco's voice stayed carefully neutral. "You want us to stand down?" The 2 words landed heavier than a shout would have. Marco's jaw tightened, some private calculation working behind his eyes, but 11 years of reading exactly when to push and when not to told him this wasn't a moment for questions. He stepped back. The second man followed, both of them retreating to the far end of the car, with the particular stillness of men choosing not to exist too loudly for a while. Luca didn't watch them go. He was still looking at the woman asleep against his shoulder, and the fact that he'd just quietly overridden a decade of iron protocol for a stranger who didn't even know his name, registered somewhere distant, filed for later examination. The train lurched into motion again. Clara stirred. It happened slowly at first, a small frown creasing between her brows, her breath catching as her body registered, before her mind did, that the surface beneath her cheek wasn't a pillow, wasn't her own couch, wasn't anything soft or familiar at all. Her eyes opened. For one suspended second, she simply blinked, disoriented, still half inside whatever exhausted dream had pulled her under. And then the fluorescent light, the unfamiliar wool against her cheek, the utter, ringing silence of an entire train car, all arrived at once. She sat bolt upright so fast her head spun. Oh my God! Her hand flew to her mouth, horror flooding her face in a rapid, visible wave. Oh my God, I am so sorry. I don't even know how that. You're fine. I'm not fine. I fell asleep on a stranger. On a train. Like she caught herself, cheeks burning, acutely aware now of every eye in the car still fixed on them, of the particular quality of silence that meant everyone had been watching and no one had dared say a word. I don't even know your name. That's usually how strangers work. The dry note in his voice caught her off guard enough that she actually looked at him, really looked, past the panic, past the mortification, and something in her chest did an uncomfortable, unfamiliar flip. Dark eyes, unreadable in a way that should have felt cold, and somehow didn't. A stillness to him that filled more space than his shoulders did. She was already gathering her bag, her jacket, moving with the jerky urgency of someone trying to outrun her own embarrassment. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. If I drooled, I don't even know. I'm so sorry. I've been awake for. You looked like you needed sleep more than I needed space. The words stopped her mid-motion. He said it simply, without performance, no charm laid over it, the way men usually softened a sentence when they wanted something back from it. Just fact, delivered flat and certain, and somehow that plainness was what undid her composure more than any polished reassurance could have. She swallowed, throat tight for reasons that had nothing to do with exhaustion anymore. That's a strange thing to say to someone who just used you as a pillow. You didn't ask permission. You also didn't do it on purpose. His gaze held hers a beat longer than strictly comfortable. There's a difference. The train began to slow. Her stop, she recognized the platform lights sliding past the window, even through the fog of humiliation still burning hot in her cheeks. And she stood so fast, she nearly caught her bag strap on the seat rail. Right. Well, thank you for not having me arrested or whatever the protocol is for accidental stranger napping. The joke came out thinner than she meant it to, nerves fraying the edges. Good night. She didn't wait for a response. She was through the doors the second they hissed open, disappearing into the platform crowd with the particular speed of someone desperate to put distance between herself and the version of tonight she'd have to think about for weeks. Luca didn't follow. He sat instead, watching the space where she'd been through the window as the train idled at the platform, some unfamiliar restlessness sitting uneasily beneath his ribs. Not urgency, not yet, just the lingering weight of a bruise shaped like fingers, and a woman who'd apologized for sleeping instead of asking why anyone would touch her like that in the first place. Marco appeared at his shoulder, voice pitched low. You want her followed? No. But his eyes hadn't left the window. Outside on the platform, Clara had stopped walking. A man stood waiting near the far end of the bench line. Average height, unremarkable coat, the kind of face that would blend into any crowd anywhere. Nothing about him should have registered as a threat, except Clara's whole body changed the instant she saw him. Her shoulders drew inward. Her chin dropped a fraction, some old, practiced instinct pulling her smaller, quieter, careful in a way she hadn't been even half asleep against a stranger's shoulder. She slowed her steps like she was buying herself seconds she didn't actually have. The man didn't smile when she reached him. He simply held out his hand, palm up, and waited. Luca's jaw tightened, the cold stillness from earlier, sharpening now into something with edges. Whoever that man was, Clara Donovan was afraid of him. And Luca intended to find out exactly why. Clara stopped 3 feet from him, close enough for conversation, far enough that a stranger watching might not immediately clock what was happening. She'd gotten good at that distance. Practiced it. "You're early," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Years of waiting tables having taught her exactly how to keep her face pleasant while everything underneath it screamed. "You're late." The man's tone stayed conversational, almost bored, which was somehow worse than if he'd sounded angry. 3 days late, actually. I've been patient. I told you Friday. It's not Friday yet. I don't like waiting near a schedule that isn't mine to set. He stepped closer, and his hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, not yet, just firm enough to make his point, without leaving a mark anyone could photograph. "You have something for me tonight, or we skip straight to the conversation you don't want to have." Clara's jaw tightened. Her free hand went to the small zippered pocket of her apron, the one she never let anyone but Rosa see her use, and pulled out a thin fold of bills. Tips from a 14-hour shift, counted and recounted 3 times in the diner bathroom before she'd trusted herself not to be short. "That's everything I have." "It's not the full amount, but it's not the full amount," he repeated, unimpressed, though he took it anyway, tucking it away with the same unbothered efficiency he might use pocketing his own change. "You understand that partial payments don't buy you partial patience. I'm working 3 jobs. I don't have a 4th to invent. That's not my problem." He leaned in, voice dropping low enough that it wouldn't carry past the 2 of them, and whatever he said next made her whole body go rigid, the color draining slowly from her face. Luca watched all of it from the train doors. He'd stepped off 2 beats after she had, unhurried, the particular kind of unhurried that made him harder to notice in a crowd than most men twice his size managed to be quiet. Marco had followed a step behind, silent, reading the platform with the same flat professional focus he applied to every room, though even he went still when he registered exactly what he was watching. Luca didn't approach. Every instinct that had built his entire life told him to close the distance in 4 strides and end whatever this was before it finished happening. He didn't. He'd learned, over more years than he cared to count, that intervening too early taught you nothing except how to make an enemy before you understood what you were fighting. So he listened instead. The platform noise swallowed most of it. A departing train 2 tracks over, the tinny echo of an announcement no one was listening to, but pieces reached him anyway, sharp enough to matter. Brother's tuition doesn't pay itself, does it? Your mother's old house, still in your name, in case you'd forgotten what's on the line. People who don't take deadlines seriously usually only need 1 lesson. Clara's face had gone from tense to something closer to fear, her free hand curling into a fist at her side, knuckles whitening even as she kept her chin up, kept her voice level, in a way that told Luca she'd had considerable practice not giving people the reaction they wanted. "I need more time." Her voice cracked at the edges despite the effort. "Please. He's just a kid. He doesn't even understand what any of this. He doesn't need to understand it. He just needs you to pay it." The man's grip on her wrist tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. "You've got 1 more week." He released her, stepping back with the same unbothered calm he'd approached with, already adjusting his coat like the conversation had cost him nothing at all. "Or your brother pays for it." He turned and walked into the thinning platform crowd without looking back, leaving Clara standing alone under the flickering overhead light, one hand pressed hard against her own sternum, like she was trying to keep something inside her chest from coming apart. Luca stayed exactly where he was. Every cell in his body wanted to close the distance. wanted to find out the name of the man who'd just threatened a child in front of the woman sworn to protect him, wanted to end it there on the platform, with the same finality he'd ended considerably smaller problems. He didn't move. Not yet. Because the thing that mattered more than his own instinct to intervene was the sentence still echoing in his skull, cold and precise, rearranging everything he'd assumed about the woman who'd fallen asleep against his shoulder an hour ago. This wasn't random. This wasn't a stranger's bad luck, a debt she'd carelessly acquired, a problem she could have avoided with better choices. Someone had targeted her, deliberately, patiently, using a child as leverage against a woman who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep pace with whatever number they'd decided her family owed. Marco stepped up beside him, voice low. "You want a name?" "I already have a guess." Luca's eyes stayed fixed on Clara, on the way her shoulders had begun, slowly, to unlock now that the man was gone, on the visible effort it took her to breathe normal again. "Run it anyway. I want to be certain before I act on instinct." "And her?" Luca didn't answer immediately. Clara had wiped her face with the back of one hand. Quick, efficient, the practiced motion of someone who'd cried in public before and hated it every time, and started walking again, toward whatever came next, in a night that clearly wasn't finished asking things of her. "Find out everything," Luca said finally, starting with her brother's name. She didn't go home. Luca clocked that within the first 2 blocks, the particular directionless but purposeful walk of someone whose night wasn't over, just because the platform confrontation was. He kept a careful distance, Marco a half step behind him, both of them dissolving into the late foot traffic with the practiced ease of men who'd spent years learning how to be present without being seen. Clara cut down a side street toward a glass office tower, dark now except for the lobby lights, and let herself in through a side entrance with a keycard on a lanyard she pulled from beneath her collar. A cleaning job, second of the night, on top of whatever shift had left the blisters on her hands. Luca watched through the tinted lobby glass as she disappeared into an elevator, exhaustion written into every line of her posture, even from this distance. Shoulders rounded forward, steps shortened, the particular economy of movement that came from a body rationing whatever energy it had left. "She's been at this a while," Marco said quietly, checking something on his phone. "Building services contracts under a company called Bright Horizon Cleaning. Small operation. Pays minimum plus a night differential." "How long has she worked there?" "Records only go back 8 months. Marco's jaw tightened slightly, which tracks with a debt that started recent. Luca said nothing, watching the elevator numbers climb, filing the detail away with the same precision he gave everything that mattered now. She emerged 90 minutes later, hair escaping its knot, a faint sheen of exhaustion sweat, visible even under the streetlights, and Luca understood, with sudden, uncomfortable clarity, that her night wasn't finished either. She walked 6 more blocks. Slower now, her steps dragging in a way she seemed to be actively fighting, one hand occasionally pressing flat against her own ribs like she was reminding her lungs how the process worked. The diner sign came into view before she did. Rosa's Corner, warm yellow light spilling out onto the sidewalk, the particular late-night hum of a place that never quite closed. Clara pushed through the door and disappeared behind the counter within seconds, tying an apron over clothes that had already survived 1 full shift and a cleaning contract on top of it. Luca took the booth by the window across the street, out of direct sightline but close enough to watch. He didn't need to watch long to understand. She moved through the next 2 hours on something that wasn't quite energy anymore. Muscle memory doing the work her body had stopped volunteering for. A customer service smile that flickered thin and then thinner with every table she cleared. Twice, she caught herself gripping the counter edge like the room had tilted beneath her. Once, she dropped a full pot of coffee, and the apology that followed came out too fast, too apologetic. The particular fear response of someone who couldn't afford the cost of a mistake, however small. Just past 2 in the morning, an older woman with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, The owner, Luca guessed, watching her move through the space with the particular authority only ownership grants, pulled Clara aside by the elbow and steered her firmly toward the back. Through the kitchen's rear window, half obscured by a stack of crates, Luca watched Clara sink into a chair in the small break room, put her head down on her folded arms, and simply stop. Not sleep, not quite, just stillness. The specific, terrible stillness of a body that had run entirely out of anything left to give and hadn't yet found the will to ask for more. Something in Luca's chest tightened in a way he didn't have a convenient name for. Boss. Marco's voice, low, pulling him back. You want me to keep watching, or you want the file first? Both. Marco's phone had already done most of the work by the time they were back in the car, headlights off, parked 2 blocks from the diner in the particular patient silence men in their line of work had long since made comfortable. Clara Donovan, 29. No priors, no debts under her own name, until 8 months ago. Marco scrolled, his expression flattening with each new line. She's got a brother, Eli Donovan, 11 years old, guardian, since their mother passed 2 years back. No father in the picture, never was. The debt started with the brother's medical bills, some kind of cardiac procedure, emergency, no insurance covering the full cost. Marco's jaw worked. She took out a loan to cover the gap. Private lender, not a bank, one of those off-book operations that doesn't ask questions and doesn't report to anyone who could regulate the interest rate. How much? 40,000 original principal. Marco's eyes flicked up, grim. Current balance, according to what I could pull, 68,000. And climbing. Luca's jaw tightened. That's not interest. That's designed. Yeah. Marco exhaled slowly. I thought so too. Who's the lender? Marco hesitated for the length of one careful breath. The particular hesitation of a man about to hand his boss information he already suspected wouldn't sit easy. Runs under a shell called Ashcroft Capital. Untraceable on paper. He turned the phone screen toward Luca, a second document already pulled up beneath the first. Ownership records, buried 3 shell companies deep, the kind of trail that only unwound if you already knew exactly where to start pulling. But the actual money behind it traces back through 2 more fronts to an account I've seen before. Say it. Marco met his eyes. Salerno. The name landed in the quiet car like a dropped glass, sharp and final. Luca sat back slowly, understanding arriving in full, cold clarity. The platform, the threat, the man's calm, practiced cruelty. None of it had been opportunistic. None of it had been random bad luck visited on a woman already drowning. Victor Salerno had built this debt on purpose. Grown it deliberately, patiently, into something no waitress working 3 jobs could ever hope to outrun. And somewhere in the last 6 hours, without meaning to, without either of them choosing it, Clara Donovan had fallen asleep against exactly the one man capable of standing between her and the family that intended to break her. The office Ashcroft Capital used for its legitimate face sat on the 9th floor of a mid-rise nobody would look at twice. Frosted glass, a receptionist who left at 6, a company name stenciled on the door in the particular anonymous font of places built to be forgotten. Luca didn't wait for morning. He arrived a little after 3, 2 men flanking the elevator, Marco silent beside him, with the particular readiness of someone who understood exactly what kind of conversation this was going to be before it started. The man who answered the private line, roused from sleep, voice thick with irritation that curdled fast into fear once he registered who was calling, met them at the building's service entrance within 20 minutes, sweating through a hastily buttoned shirt. Mr. Moretti. He didn't offer a hand. He'd clearly been told at some point in his career exactly what happened to men who tried. I wasn't informed you had business with our firm. You wouldn't be. I didn't have business with your firm 2 hours ago. Luca walked past him into the darkened lobby without waiting for permission. Footsteps unhurried, the particular calm of a man who'd already decided how this conversation ended, before it began. "I have a loan file. Donovan, I want everything. Origination, terms, every amendment made to the account since it opened." The man's face went the color of the frosted glass behind him. "That information is confidential. I'm not authorized to." "You're authorized to keep breathing comfortably for the next several minutes," Marco said, pleasant, almost bored, "which is more than I'd bet on if you finish that sentence." The file arrived on a tablet 11 minutes later, hands shaking badly enough that the man dropped it once before managing to unlock the screen and hand it over. Luca read in silence, Marco reading over his shoulder, and the picture that assembled itself was worse in its particular quiet cruelty than either of them had expected. The loan hadn't been taken out in Clara's name. It belonged to Eli Donovan, 11 years old, co-signed by his sister as legal guardian, a technicality that made her responsible for the debt without ever making it hers. 40,000 principal, a rate that should have been illegal in any jurisdiction with a functioning regulator, and beneath the original terms, a long, methodical trail of amendments. Interest hikes, timed with surgical precision. A processing fee, added the week Clara had missed a single payment by 4 days. A penalty clause triggered not by anything Clara had done, but by a clerical review that conveniently discovered a documentation error 3 months after the loan had already funded, an error that added $11,000 to the balance overnight, with no explanation offered and no appeal available. "This isn't predatory lending," Marco said quietly, scrolling further. "This is engineered. Every increase lines up with something. Look, this bump here, $8,000, dated 2 days ago." Luca's jaw tightened as he found the entry. 2 days ago. The same week Victor Salerno had told her on a train platform under flickering light that she had 1 more week or her brother would pay for it. "Why?" Luca said, low, more to himself than to the trembling man across the desk. "Would Salerno inflate a debt he already controls completely? He doesn't need leverage on a woman who's already this far underwater. He could collect at any point he chooses." The realization arrived a half-second before the man across from him made the mistake of answering out loud, thinking silence meant an opening. "It's not about the money," the man said, too eager to prove his own irrelevance to the situation, too frightened to recognize what he was handing over. Mr. Salerno's instructions were specific. Keep the pressure escalating. Keep her desperate enough to be visible, noticeable. Luca went very still. Noticeable to whom? The man's mouth opened, then closed, some very late instinct for self-preservation finally kicking in. Luca didn't need him to finish the sentence. He already understood, with the particular cold clarity that came only when every scattered piece of a problem finally locked into a single, complete shape. This wasn't about a debt at all. Clara Donovan had never been the target. She was the bait. A woman drowning under an engineered weight, pushed methodically toward exhaustion and desperation, positioned wherever Salerno's people could arrange it, waiting for the one variable they couldn't fully control, whether Luca Moretti would notice her. He had. On a train, on an ordinary Tuesday night, in a seat she hadn't chosen with any purpose beyond simple, bone-deep exhaustion, she'd fallen asleep against the one man in the city capable of ending her family's nightmare. And the debt had jumped $8,000 2 days before that happened. Not after. Before. Luca's mind ran the timeline again, slower this time, checking every assumption for the crack he desperately hoped he'd find, and didn't. Marco's silence beside him carried the same weight, the recognition of 2 men who understood, without needing to say it aloud, exactly what that sequence implied. "They knew," Luca said quietly, "before I ever sat beside her. They knew which train, which car, boss. They put her there." The words came out flat, controlled. The particular flatness Marco had learned over 11 years meant something dangerous was assembling itself behind Luca's expression. The exhaustion is real. The debt is real. Her brother's danger is real. But the placement, the seat, the timing, all of it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every tender, unguarded thing that had shifted in him over the last several hours, the decision to let her sleep, the restraint on the platform, the quiet, unfamiliar ache of watching her collapse into a break-room chair with nothing left to give, sat now beside a far colder fact. Someone had built the conditions for exactly that softening to happen, which meant either Clara Donovan was an unwitting piece moved into position by people who understood Luca better than he liked to admit, or she wasn't unwitting at all. He hated, more than he'd admit even to Marco, how much he didn't believe the second possibility, how thoroughly her fear on that platform, the tremor in her hands, the particular unguarded exhaustion of a woman with nothing left to perform, had already convinced him she was exactly what she appeared to be. A woman being crushed, not a woman running a con. But instinct wasn't proof, and proof was the only currency that had ever kept him alive this long. "Find out who selected that train car," he said finally, voice low, controlled, dangerous in its total lack of heat. "Find out who knew her schedule well enough to guarantee she'd be exhausted enough to fall asleep on a stranger. And find out," he added, quieter, "whether that stranger was ever supposed to be me specifically, or whether I simply happened to be the man sitting in the wrong seat at the right time." Marco didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost its usual dry edge entirely. "And if it was you, specifically," Luca's eyes stayed fixed on the tablet, on the $8,000 amendment, dated 2 days before a woman he barely knew had fallen asleep against his shoulder, and quietly rearranged something in his chest he'd assumed was permanently locked. "Then Salerno understands me a great deal better than I'm comfortable with," he said, "and he's about to learn exactly how badly that miscalculation is going to cost him." Clara clocked the car on her walk home, the second morning in a row. Same make, same dark windows, parked a half block from her building, with the particular stillness of something that wasn't going anywhere. She'd told herself the first time it was nothing. Coincidence. A city full of black sedans, and not every one of them belonged to men who tracked exhausted waitresses home from double shifts. The second time, she stopped pretending. She crossed the street directly toward it, exhaustion burning off into something sharper, something with teeth, and rapped her knuckles hard against the passenger window before she could talk herself out of it. The window lowered. Luca sat in the driver's seat, jacket off, sleeves rolled, looking for all the world like a man who hadn't spent the better part of 2 days rearranging his own priorities around a woman he'd met once, badly, on public transit. "You've been following me." Her voice came out low, controlled in the way she'd learned to control things when she was too tired to fully trust her own volume. "For 2 days. "Yes." The flat, immediate honesty of it knocked something loose in her chest that she'd been braced to fight for. She'd expected denial, some smooth explanation designed to make her doubt her own eyes, and instead she got a single syllable that offered no cover at all. "Yes," she repeated, incredulous. "That's it. Just, yes. You want a different answer? I don't have one that's more accurate. I want you to get out of your car and explain to my face why a man I met one time, for 11 minutes, on a train, thinks it's acceptable to have me watched." Her hands had curled into fists at her sides, the tremor from exhaustion sharpening into something closer to rage now that she had a target for it. "Do you have any idea how that looks? How that feels? I already have one man in this city deciding what happens to my life without asking me. I don't need two." Something flickered across his face at that. Not quite a wince, but close, the particular tightness of a man absorbing a hit he'd half expected and still felt fully. He stepped out of the car. Up close, under the streetlight, he looked less like the composed stranger from the train and more like someone who hadn't slept properly either, though he wore it with considerably more discipline than she managed. "I know what your debt is," he said quietly. "I know it isn't yours. I know your brother's name is Eli, that he's 11, that the loan against his medical bills has been inflated deliberately, on a schedule, by a man who works for a family that would very much like to see me react badly to all of it. Clara's breath caught, the anger in her chest momentarily overtaken by something colder, the particular vertigo of hearing your entire private catastrophe recited back to you by a stranger who'd apparently spent 2 days memorizing it. You had me investigated. I had the threat against you investigated. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one from where you're standing. It doesn't feel like a difference at all. Her voice cracked, and she hated it. Hated the way exhaustion stripped away every careful wall she usually kept between herself and the people who underestimated how much she was carrying. You don't get to do that. You don't get to decide I'm your problem to solve just because I fell asleep on you by accident. Oh, where? Then why are you still parked outside my building at 11 at night? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost some of its usual controlled flatness, something rougher moving underneath it. Because a man tried to intimidate a woman on a train platform 2 nights ago, using her brother's safety as leverage, and I watched it happen and didn't do anything except gather information. His jaw tightened. That doesn't sit well with me. I don't particularly care whether it should. So this is about your conscience, not about me. It became about you the moment I understood exactly how deliberately someone built the conditions for you to end up in that seat, on that train, exhausted enough to fall asleep on the one man in this city capable of ending what's happening to your family. He held her gaze, steady, despite the accusation sitting behind it. You didn't choose that seat by accident, Clara. Someone chose it for you. The words landed like ice water. That's not... She stopped, throat working, the particular vertigo of having your worst private fear confirmed by someone with the resources to actually know. That's not possible. I was just tired. I missed my bus. I know. The exhaustion is real. The debt is real. Your brother's danger is real. His voice gentled, fractionally, though nothing else about him softened. But the timing wasn't luck. It was designed to put you exactly where you ended up. Which means whoever is squeezing your family isn't only interested in the money anymore. Clara pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, the weight of 2 exhausting days compounding into something that threatened to buckle her knees right there on the sidewalk. So what? She said finally, voice thin. You show up, you throw money at it, you make the bad men disappear, and I'm supposed to be grateful. Is that the arrangement you had in mind? I hadn't gotten that far. Because that's not. I won't do that. She straightened, forcing steel back into her spine, even as her body screamed for permission to stop fighting. I have spent 2 years keeping my brother safe on my own. I've worked myself half to death doing it, and it's been humiliating and exhausting, and lonely in ways I don't have the energy to explain to a stranger in a very nice suit, but it's mine. It's my fight. I won't trade being crushed by one powerful man for being owned by another. I'm not asking to own you. You're already following me. What would you call it? Concern, he said, low, unflinching, which I recognize doesn't come with a clean track record in my line of work. I'm not offering to make you disappear into something safer and quieter that also happens to belong to me. I'm telling you I understand exactly what's coming for your brother, and I have the means to stop it, and I don't particularly care whether you find that inconvenient. That's not respect. That's just control with better manners. Something in his expression tightened, not anger, closer to recognition, like the accusation had found a target he'd been half expecting to take a hit eventually. You're not wrong to be angry, he said finally. You didn't ask for any of this. Not the debt, not the train, not me deciding your safety mattered to me before I fully understood why. He held her gaze, steady. I won't apologize for having you watch these past 2 days. I will apologize for not telling you sooner. Clara opened her mouth, to argue further, to hold the line she'd built so carefully around herself, to remind him one more time exactly how little his money and his men and his quiet, controlled concern were worth to a woman who'd learned the hard way that powerful men always eventually wanted something back. Her phone buzzed against her hip. She almost ignored it, almost let the moment between them stretch out long enough to finish the argument properly. But something in the timing, late enough that a text this hour rarely meant anything good, pulled her hand toward her pocket before she'd fully decided to check it. The screen lit up. A photograph. Grainy, taken from across a street, clearly shot without the subject's knowledge. Eli, backpack slung over one shoulder, standing outside the front gate of his school in the flat gray light of early evening pickup. And behind him, half obscured by a parked delivery van, a man stood watching. Still, patient, not bothering to hide particularly well, as though the point wasn't concealment at all. The point was being seen. No caption accompanied the image. None was needed. Clara's hand began to shake, the phone nearly slipping from her fingers, and every argument she'd been building for the last 10 minutes evaporated instantly beneath a single, roaring wave of terror. Luca's expression had already changed before she managed to turn the screen toward him, some cold and absolute stillness settling over his face the moment he understood, without being told, exactly what he was looking at. Luca had his phone to his ear before Clara finished processing what she was looking at. Marco, Eli Donovan's school. Now, his voice had dropped into something Clara hadn't heard from him yet. Flat, absolute, every trace of the careful restraint from the last 10 minutes gone entirely. I want eyes on that block in under 4 minutes, and I want the man in that photo identified before he leaves the frame. He didn't wait for a response. He was already moving, pulling open the passenger door of the sedan, and it took Clara a full second to realize the gesture was meant for her. "Get in! That's my brother's school! That's—" Her voice broke, the phone still clutched in a white-knuckled grip. "That's a 15-minute drive. He could be 11. With the lights I'm about to run." He was already behind the wheel, engine turning over, before she'd fully dropped into the seat beside him. "Call the school. Tell them not to release him to anyone who isn't you, or a name on his approved pickup list. No exceptions, no matter what identification they're shown." Her hands shook too badly to manage the school's number on the first attempt. She tried again, breath coming in short, uneven pulls, and Luca reached over without a word and steadied her wrist just long enough for her to find the contact. The line rang twice before the front office picked up, and Clara's voice cracked wide open the moment she started talking. Fast, urgent, barely coherent, while the car surged through a yellow light that had no business still being yellow by the time they cleared the intersection. Beside her, Luca's phone buzzed against the console. He read the screen without slowing. "Marco's 2 minutes out. He's pulling 2 more men from the East team." His jaw was a hard, controlled line. "The school has a resource officer on site during pickup hours. I've already had someone reach him directly. You have people everywhere." It came out somewhere between accusation and disbelief, her mind still catching up to the sheer scale of what she was witnessing. A phone call, 4 minutes, and an entire operation assembling itself around one photograph. "I have people who understand that this conversation isn't finished being dangerous just because we're having it privately." They reached the school in 9 minutes. The block outside the gate looked, on the surface, unchanged. Parents idling at the curb, a cluster of kids waiting under the flagpole, the ordinary chaos of late pickup. But threaded through it now, Clara could see what she hadn't been able to 2 nights ago on the train platform. 2 men in dark jackets positioned at opposite ends of the block, unhurried, scanning faces with the particular patient focus of men who did this for a living. A third stood near the delivery van from the photograph, already speaking low into a phone. Marco met them at the gate, expression tight. "He's inside. Front office has him, and he's fine. Scared, but fine." Marco's eyes flicked toward Clara, softer than she expected from a man she'd only ever seen flanking Luca like a piece of furniture built for violence. "The man in the photo cleared out 4 minutes before we got here. We got a partial look at his vehicle. Running the plate now. He knew we'd respond fast, Luca said, low. That was probably the point. Clara was already moving past both of them, through the gate, half running toward the front office, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it behind her eyes. Eli was sitting in a plastic chair just inside the door, backpack still on, hands folded tight in his lap, and the second he saw her, his whole small frame crumpled with a relief that broke something loose in her chest all over again. Clara, I'm here. I'm here, I've got you. She dropped to her knees in front of him, pulling him into her arms hard enough that he made a small, surprised sound, and held on like letting go might undo the fact that he was still whole, still warm, still hers. There was a man watching me, Eli said against her shoulder, voice small and careful, in the way he'd learned to be careful about everything since their mother died. He didn't do anything. He just watched. It felt wrong. You did exactly the right thing, staying inside with Mrs. Alvarez. Clara pulled back enough to look at him, cataloging every inch of his face for anything that told a different story than the one he was giving her. I promise you're safe. She didn't know, saying it, whether it was true anymore. Outside, through the office's front window, she watched Luca standing near the gate with Marco, both men's postures rigid with a controlled, coiled violence she hadn't let herself fully register until this exact moment. Not 2 nights ago on a train, not in his car 20 minutes earlier, but now, watching him scan the street the way a predator studies terrain it already knows it's going to have to defend. This was his actual world. Not the calm, careful stranger who'd let her sleep on his shoulder. Not the man who'd admitted to following her with unsettling honesty. This, men positioned on street corners, a resource officer receiving a phone call from someone with enough reach to arrange it in under 4 minutes. An 11-year-old boy, sitting in an office chair because a stranger had stood outside his school, just to prove he could. Her stomach turned cold with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite gratitude either. If she let this man any closer, the surveillance, the violence held one careful degree beneath the surface, the sheer terrifying scale of what he was capable of mobilizing in minutes became the shape of her life. Eli's life, not the debt collector on the platform, not the exhausting math of 3 jobs and a shrinking bank account. She kept Eli's hand in hers as they walked back out to the car, and Luca fell into step beside them without a word, his eyes never fully leaving the perimeter of the block even as he walked. "Thank you," she said quietly, once Eli was buckled into the back seat, headphones already in, the particular resilience of a child determined to make himself smaller than the danger around him. "For getting here fast, I mean that. You don't need to thank me for doing the obvious thing. It wasn't obvious to me 2 hours ago that you'd have 4 men on a school block within 9 minutes of a text message." She looked at him, some of the anger from earlier bleeding slowly back into her voice, layered now with something rawer underneath it. "This is your world, not mine. And I don't think I can let my brother grow up inside it, no matter how safe you make it feel for one afternoon." Something flickered across his face, not quite a wound, but adjacent to one. "I understand." "Do you?" "I understand that you're frightened, and that fear is entirely reasonable, and that nothing I say right now is going to make the last hour feel smaller than it was." His voice had gone quiet, controlled in a way that felt less like distance now, and more like restraint. "I'm not going to pretend my world is safe. It isn't. But the alternative, currently threatening your brother, isn't safety either. It's just danger, without anyone standing between it and you." She didn't have an answer for that. She got into the car instead. Exhaustion and fear and something dangerously close to gratitude tangled too tightly together to separate into anything coherent. Luca's phone buzzed once, sharp against the console, as he pulled away from the curb. He glanced at the screen at the next red light, and Clara watched his expression shift, the careful control cracking, just slightly, into something colder and more dangerous than she'd seen from him yet. He turned the phone so she could read it, jaw tight, eyes fixed straight ahead on the road. A single line, sent from an unknown number, time-stamped less than a minute ago. You like her? Watch what happens next. Chapter 8. The Public Line. Luca didn't reply to the message. He set the phone face down on the console, and the stillness that settled over him was worse than shouting would have been. The particular quiet Clara was already learning to recognize as the calm before he decided something irreversible. Who sent that? No one who signs their name. He pulled away from the curb, checking the mirrors with a precision that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago, which means it came from someone confident enough not to need to. Salerno, or someone speaking for him. His jaw worked. It doesn't matter which. The message is the same either way. In the back seat, Eli had fallen asleep against the window within 4 blocks, the specific boneless exhaustion of a child who'd spent his fear on staying quiet all afternoon and had nothing left to spend on staying awake. Clara watched him in the side mirror, throat tight, and didn't ask where they were going. She'd stopped having the energy to argue about destinations an hour ago. They ended up at Rosa's. It made no sense until it did. A public place, cameras on the corner, a woman behind the counter who'd known Clara for 6 years and would remember exactly who'd been standing where if anyone ever asked her to. Luca parked across the street and didn't get out immediately, watching the diner's windows with the same flat, patient focus he'd given the school block. Why here? Because Salerno wants me reactive and private. Somewhere I can be reckless without witnesses. He finally opened his door. I'd rather give him witnesses. She didn't understand until they were inside. Eli tucked into the corner booth with a hot chocolate Rosa produced without being asked. And Clara was still peeling off her jacket when the bell over the door rang and the entire temperature of the room changed. Victor Salerno didn't look like a man who threatened children on train platforms. He looked unremarkable, mid-height, gray at the temples, a coat that could have belonged to an accountant, and that was precisely what made him worse in daylight than he'd been in shadow. He didn't approach the booth. He stopped at the counter instead, close enough to be heard, far enough to claim later he'd never come near. Ms. Donovan. His voice carried the same bored calm from the platform. I heard you had an eventful afternoon. I hope your brother's doing well. Rosa's hand froze on the coffee pot. Clara's whole body went rigid, some old instinct pulling her half a step in front of Eli's booth without deciding to. Luca moved before she finished the motion. He crossed the diner unhurried, the way he did everything, and stopped close enough to Salerno that anyone watching would understand instantly which of them the room actually belonged to. You're a long way from your usual corners, Victor. Luca. Salerno's smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. I heard you'd developed an interest in local waitresses. I wanted to see it for myself. You wanted to see if the message landed. Did it? It landed. Luca's voice stayed level, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more dangerous than if he'd raised it. I want to be precise about what happens next, so there's no confusion later about who misunderstood whom. He didn't lower his voice. Clara understood, watching him, that he wasn't trying to keep this private at all. Rosa behind the counter, 2 customers frozen mid-bite near the window, even the cook visible through the pass-through, all of it deliberate. He wanted this witnessed. Clara Donovan and her brother are under my protection. Not as a favor, not as a courtesy I might reconsider, as a fact. Effective the moment you decided a photograph of an 11-year-old outside his school was an acceptable way to make a point. His eyes didn't leave Salerno's face. Anything that touches either of them touches me directly. I'd have thought a man in your position understood exactly what that means before he arranged for someone to stand outside a school gate. Salerno's easy composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. That's a significant claim to make over a woman you've known 4 days. It's not a claim. It's a boundary. Luca's tone never changed, never rose, and that flatness was somehow worse than any threat shouted across the room would have been. You inflated a child's medical debt to manufacture leverage you thought you could use against me indirectly. That was clever, and it worked, right up until it stopped being indirect. Now it's just a mistake. Careful. Salerno's voice had lost its bored edge entirely now, something harder surfacing underneath. Territory's a delicate thing to redraw in public. I'm not redrawing anything. I'm telling you where the line already is, so you stop pretending you couldn't see it. Luca leaned in, just slightly, voice dropping low enough that only the two of them could catch the next part. Send another man near that school, and I won't bother with warnings next time. Salerno held his gaze a beat longer than was comfortable for anyone else in the room, some silent calculation working behind his eyes. And then, with the particular grace of a man choosing to lose gracefully rather than lose badly, he stepped back, straightening his coat. Noted. He glanced past Luca's shoulder, toward the booth where Clara stood frozen, one hand still resting protectively on the table near Eli. Ms. Donovan, my apologies for the intrusion. He left without hurrying, the bell chiming once behind him, and the diner exhaled as a single organism the moment the door swung shut. Clara's legs nearly gave out. She sank into the booth across from Eli, hands shaking too hard to hide, and it took a long moment before she trusted her voice enough to use it. Luca crossed back to the booth, and didn't sit, just stood at the end of the table, watching her with an expression she couldn't fully name. You just declared war on him, in front of witnesses. Her voice came out thin, disbelieving. You did that on purpose. I did it so there'd never be a version of tonight, where he claims he didn't understand the stakes. His voice had gentled, fractionally, now that the room had emptied of anyone worth performing for. He won't move against Eli again, not carelessly, not without knowing exactly what it costs him. And what did it cost you? Claiming me like that, in public, to a man like him? Nothing I wasn't already prepared to spend. She should have hated it. Every instinct she'd built over 2 years of surviving alone told her this was exactly the trap Rosa had warned her about. A powerful man drawing lines around her like property, and the whole room watching him do it. She should have felt smaller for it, owned, folded into something she hadn't agreed to. Instead, sitting in the booth with her brother's hand, finding hers under the table, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could remember. Safe. The fear and the relief tangled together so tightly she couldn't separate them anymore. And that frightened her more than Salerno's visit had. Because she didn't want to need this, didn't want to need him, and some traitorous, exhausted part of her chest had already stopped arguing about it. Eli tugged her sleeve, voice small, pitched low enough that it was meant only for her. Clara! His eyes were fixed on the window, on the empty street where Salerno had disappeared. Is he going to hurt someone because of us? She didn't answer Eli right away. She couldn't, not with Luca standing 3 feet away, not with the truth still forming somewhere she hadn't let herself look at directly yet. She squeezed her brother's hand instead, told him to finish his hot chocolate, and asked Rosa if he could stay in the back office for 10 minutes. Then she walked outside, into the cold, and waited for Luca to follow. He did, closing the door behind him, and the street had gone quiet enough that she could hear her own pulse in her ears. My brother just asked me if you're going to hurt someone. Her voice came out low, steadier than she felt. Do you understand what that does to a kid? He's 11. He shouldn't know what that question even means. I know. That's it? You know? What do you want me to say, Clara? His voice hadn't risen, but something under it had shifted, rawer than the composed stillness she'd gotten used to. That I regret making it clear you're not available to be threatened? I don't. I'd do it again in that exact room, in front of that exact man, without changing a single word. You didn't ask me first. No. That's the part I can't. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes, exhaustion and fury tangled too tight to separate. You keep making decisions about my life, like I'm a problem you're managing. The debt, the school, now this. You didn't ask me once. You just acted, and I'm supposed to be grateful you acted well. I am asking you now. After the fact isn't asking, it's informing. He didn't argue that. She watched something in his jaw tighten, an old, practiced control absorbing a hit he'd apparently decided he deserved. You're right, he said finally. I didn't ask. I've spent my whole life solving problems before anyone else in the room finishes identifying them, and it's kept people alive who wouldn't have survived if I'd waited for permission. I don't know how to stand still long enough to ask a woman whether she wants to be protected while a man is actively deciding whether to hurt her brother. Then learn. Because I won't be property, Luca. Not his, and not yours. I've spent 2 years making sure no one gets to decide what happens to Eli and me without our say. I'm not trading Salerno's ownership for a nicer version wearing a better suit. I don't want to own you. Everything you've done says otherwise. Everything I've done says I want you breathing. His voice cracked, just slightly. The first real fracture she'd seen in him since the train. There's a difference, even if the outside of it looks the same from where you're standing. She wanted to keep arguing. Wanted to hold the line. The way she'd held it against every man who'd ever assumed her exhaustion made her small. But something in his face had shifted. Not defensive anymore. Closer to exposed. And it stopped her before she could load the next accusation. Why? She said instead, quieter. Why any of this? You don't know me. 4 days ago you didn't know I existed. That's not true. She went still. I've known who you were for months, he said. Since before the train. That's not possible. I would have. You served me coffee at Rose's counter 7 months ago. A booth had opened up, and I took the counter seat instead, out of habit, wanting 5 minutes where no one recognized my name. His eyes held hers, steady, despite the confession sitting underneath it. There was a man 2 stools down. Drunk, aggressive, saying something ugly to the woman bussing tables. Young, new, barely able to defend herself. You didn't call security. You didn't wait for someone else to handle it. You put yourself between them and told him, calm as anything, that he could finish his coffee or finish his sentence, but not both. Clara's breath caught, some distant memory surfacing, a bad night, a drunk regular, nothing she'd thought twice about since. He left, she said slowly. I don't even remember it being anything. It wasn't anything, to you. You did it and moved on to the next table like it cost you nothing. His voice had gone low, almost private now. I watched a woman with no power in that room use the only leverage she had, her own nerve, to protect a stranger who couldn't protect herself. And then you poured my coffee 2 minutes later and looked at me like I was just another tired man at the counter. Not a name, not a threat, just a man. So you what? Remembered me. I've had you watched, off and on, since that night. He said it plainly, no softening. The same flat honesty he'd given her in his car 2 nights ago. Nothing invasive. I knew where you worked. I knew you'd taken on the cleaning contract 8 months ago, around the same time your brother's medical bills started. I told myself it wasn't anything. A curiosity, a debt of interest I hadn't decided what to do with. And then I fell asleep on you. And then you fell asleep on me, on a train I don't normally take, in a city where I don't leave things to accident any more than I have to. His jaw tightened. I don't fully believe that was coincidence. I told you that already. But whether Salerno arranged the seating or not, the woman who fell asleep against my shoulder wasn't a stranger to me. She was someone I'd already been watching for months, for reasons that had nothing to do with a debt or a rival family. Clara stood very still, the cold forgotten, every careful wall she'd built over the last 4 days, suddenly feeling thinner than she'd trusted them to be. Say that again, she said quietly. The part where I wasn't a stranger. I noticed you 7 months ago. In a diner, over coffee, because of who you were when you thought no one important was watching. She looked at him for a long moment, something unsteady moving behind her eyes. Not quite trust, not quite fear, Some third thing she didn't have a name for yet. Would you have noticed me? She asked slowly, if I hadn't fallen asleep on you? He didn't answer right away. Clara watched him take the question seriously, the way he seemed to take everything, turning it over before he'd let himself speak, unwilling to hand her a comfortable lie just because the truth cost him something. I don't know, he said finally. That's the honest answer, and I know it's not the one you want. I don't want a performance. I want the truth. The truth is, I'd been watching you for months and hadn't done anything about it. I told myself it wasn't the right time, or the right reason, or that a man in my position doesn't walk into a diner and tell a waitress he can't stop thinking about the way she stood up to a drunk stranger. His voice stayed low, even. No charm layered over any of it. I might have stayed exactly where I was indefinitely, watching, never crossing the distance. You falling asleep on that train didn't create what I felt. It just removed my excuse for doing nothing about it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have that isn't a lie. He held her gaze, steady. I don't know if I'd have found my way to you without the train. I know I wanted to. That's the part I can promise you. Something in her chest loosened, slow and uneven, like a knot she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was tied. She didn't say anything for a long moment. The street had gone quiet around them, the diner's light spilling warm across the sidewalk. Eli safe inside, with Rosa's steady, watchful presence standing between him and anything the night still wanted to try. I'm not doing this because I need rescuing, she said finally. I know. I mean it. I've survived worse than Salerno without a man like you deciding to fix it for me. I can survive this too, if I have to. I believe you. Then why does it feel like you're waiting for me to fall apart so you have a reason to catch me? I'm not waiting for that. His jaw tightened, something raw moving under the words. I'm waiting for you to choose it, not because you're drowning. Not because Salerno left you no other option. I've spent 4 days making decisions for you because that's the only language I know fluently. And every time I've done it, you've told me exactly how much it costs you. I'm done doing that tonight. So what are you offering, if it's not rescue? Nothing, if that's what you need it to be. He said it plainly. No pressure behind it. No leverage. I'll keep Eli safe either way. That was never conditional on anything you decide about me. But I'm not going to pretend I don't want you to stay tonight. I'd rather you know that and choose against it than let you think I never asked. Clara looked at him for a long time, the cold air sharp in her lungs, every careful argument she'd built over the last 4 days, sitting quiet now instead of shouting. She thought about the platform, the bruise on her wrist, the particular exhaustion of carrying everything alone for 2 years because no one had ever once made it safe to set any of it down. She thought about Rosa's warning. Power like that doesn't protect, it consumes. And found, for the first time, that she didn't fully believe it applied to the man standing in front of her, hands empty, offering her a door instead of a leash. I'm not choosing you because I'm scared, she said quietly. I need you to understand that. If I stay tonight, it's not because Salerno frightened me into needing you. I understand. I'm choosing because when you told Salerno I was under your protection, I wasn't angry that you'd claimed something. I was angry that you hadn't asked first. Those aren't the same thing. She held his gaze, steadier now than she'd been all night. Ask me. Something shifted in his expression. Not triumph, nothing that easy. Just quiet, careful attention. The same precision he'd given her bruised wrist on the train 4 days ago. Come home with me tonight, he said. Not because it's safer, because I want you there, and I'd rather you choose it than fall into it. And if I say no, then I'll drive you and Eli home, and I'll be outside your building tomorrow, whether you want me there or not. Because his safety was never a bargaining chip. His voice softened, just slightly. But I'm hoping you say yes. Rosa walked Eli out a few minutes later, already half asleep on his feet, and it was Marco, appearing quietly from wherever he'd been keeping watch, who offered to see him home, and stay the night on the couch, an offer Clara accepted only after Eli himself, blinking up at Marco with sleepy, unguarded trust, said he didn't mind. Which left her standing on the sidewalk with Luca, the choice finally fully hers. She got in the car. His penthouse sat high enough that the city noise thinned into something almost gentle, lights scattered below like something spilled and left to settle. She stood at the balcony doors a long moment before he came to stand beside her, not touching, not asking for anything more than her presence in the room. Below, in the distance, a train crossed the elevated line, windows lit gold against the dark, carrying some other exhausted stranger toward whatever waited for them at the end of the night. Clara turned away from the window, and this time, when she finally let herself close her eyes against his shoulder, it wasn't exhaustion that put her there. It was a choice. She didn't fall asleep alone. That's the story. If you believe the strongest people are usually the ones carrying the most in silence, the ones who never ask for help until someone finally notices, hit subscribe, because these are the stories we tell here every week. And I want to know, did you want Clara to stay, or did you want her to walk away and prove she never needed saving at all? Tell me in the comments. Type, "She chose him," if you were rooting for that door to close behind her tonight. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, share it with someone who needs a reminder that exhaustion isn't weakness, and being noticed isn't the same as being rescued. See you in the next one.